Ever feel like you're on the outside looking in when it comes to, like, really understanding what's going on in the world?
I think we all feel that way sometimes.
Yeah, it can be kind of overwhelming, right?
Yeah.
Like trying to make sense of global power dynamics, conflicts erupting all over, and those high stakes decisions being made behind closed doors.
Definitely, especially with everything happening so fast these days.
Exactly. And that's exactly why we're diving deep into Bob Woodward's War
Oh,
today.
that's a good one. I just finished it myself, actually.
Yeah, it's packed with these crazy revelations and insider accounts of how world leaders are grappling with some seriously intense challenges, like the war in Ukraine, the Hamas attacks on Israel, and even the looming threat of nuclear conflict.
Yeah, and Woodward's got this knack for, like, getting into the minds of these powerful figures. He doesn't just report on the events. He pulls back the curtain and shows you how they think, the pressures they face, and the calculations they make.
It's wild, right? And he starts by taking us back to the Trump era, which, let's be honest, was already pretty wild on its own.
Yeah, no shortage of drama there.
Okay, so get this. Trump straight up brags to Woodward about how close he is with Putin, saying things like, I understand him better than anybody.
It's that whole personal relationships over traditional diplomacy approach that really defined Trump's foreign policy.
Exactly. And Woodward reveals that Trump even claimed he knew Putin was going to invade Ukraine all along, but that he could have stopped it if he had stayed in office.
It's pretty mind-blowing, right? And it really sets the stage for understanding how Biden approached the crisis when he took office.
Okay, so speaking of Biden, Woodward uses this term escalatory ladder to describe the tightrope walk Biden had to navigate. Essentially, every decision he made, every action he took, carried the risk of escalating the conflict.
Yeah, like one wrong move could potentially trigger a wider war, even a nuclear one. It's terrifying to think about.
Absolutely. And Woodward paints this really intense picture of those days leading up to the invasion. Intelligence reports were flooding in, analysts were trying to figure out Putin's true intentions, and there was this constant fear that things could spiral out of control.
And that fear was very real, especially when you consider that Putin had already demonstrated his willingness to use force in Crimea and eastern Ukraine.
Right, so there was this precedent. And Woodward even quotes Biden as saying something like, this is the guy who's going to use tactical nuclear weapons.
Wow, that's chilling. I don't remember that quote specifically.
Yeah, it really captures the gravity of the situation, but it also highlights the challenge Biden faced. How do you support Ukraine without provoking Putin and triggering a wider conflict?
It's a classic dilemma in international relations. And what's fascinating is that this wasn't just a two-player game between the U.S. and Russia. China played a significant role behind the scenes.
Oh, yeah, China. Okay, so this is where it gets really interesting. Woodward reveals all these secret back-channel communications between the U.S. and China during this whole thing.
Back channels are like these unofficial lines of communication, right? They allow countries to have these sensitive conversations outside of the formal diplomatic channels.
Exactly. And in this case, the U.S. was using these back channels to try and figure out where China stood on the whole Ukraine situation.
I imagine they were also trying to see if China could help deter Putin from resorting to nuclear weapons.
And there's this one anecdote where General Milley, the top U.S. military guy, actually calls up his Chinese counterpart to assure him that the U.S. isn't planning to attack China.
Oh, wow. So even amidst this major international crisis, they're trying to prevent misunderstandings and keep those lines of communication open.
Yeah, it's like they're playing this high-stakes game of chess, but with the fate of the world hanging in the balance.
It makes you realize just how fragile the whole system really is.
And all of this is happening while Biden is also dealing with the aftermath of the chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan.
Right, which definitely damaged America's credibility on the world stage and emboldened adversaries like Putin and the leaders of Hamas.
So it's this incredibly complex and volatile situation. But amidst all of this political maneuvering, Woodward doesn't lose sight of the human cost.
Yeah, he does a really good job of bringing in the personal stories, the individual experiences that get lost in the grand narratives of war and politics.
He tells the story of Zelensky and his family, and it's just heartbreaking. Imagine being a parent trying to comfort your child while bombs are falling all around you.
I can't even imagine. And the details Woodward shares are just so vivid, like Zelensky's daughter scattering Lego pieces on the floor,
Yeah.
only to find them mysteriously reassembled overnight, presumably by Russian intelligence.
Chilling, right. It just shows you the lengths to which they were willing to go to intimidate and destabilize the Ukrainian leadership.
Yeah, it's a reminder that these geopolitical events aren't just abstract happenings on a distant stage. They have a very real impact on the lives of individuals and families.
And then Woodward shifts our attention to another conflict that erupted in October 2023, the Hamas attacks on Israel.
Oh, that was just horrific. The brutality, the sheer scale of the violence, it was truly shocking.
This section of the book is really hard to read. He doesn't shy away from the details, and it gives you a real sense of the terror that gripped Israel that day.
It's like he transports you right into the heart of the conflict, the chaos, the fear, the desperate attempts to survive.
There's this one detail that just stuck with me about the discovery of a young woman's body. It's clear that she was treated with just utter disrespect by Hamas militants.
Ugh, it's just a brutal reminder of the dehumanizing nature of war and violence.
And Woodward goes beyond just recounting the events of the attacks. He digs into the intelligence failures that allowed it to happen, the scramble to contain the crisis, and the diplomatic efforts to prevent it from escalating further.
It's like watching a car crash in slow motion, you know? You can see all the warning signs, but you can't do anything to stop it.
And you see Biden working the phones, trying to leverage his relationships with leaders in the Middle East, especially with Egypt, to get them to open the border crossing for humanitarian aid.
Yeah, so much is riding on these personal relationships in these situations, and you see that playing out again and again throughout the book.
So we've got these two major conflicts happening simultaneously, and Biden's in the middle of it all, trying to manage the U.S. response, maintain global stability, and prevent things from spiraling even further out of control.
Talk about a high-pressure job. And on top of that, he's got a re-election campaign to worry about, which Woodward also dives into in detail.
It's crazy to think about the weight of the world that's on his shoulders, and Woodward doesn't shy away from the moments where Biden seems to struggle. He talks about Biden's age, his occasional moments of fatigue, those instances where he loses his train of thought during speeches.
Right, which, of course, his opponents are quick to seize on and use against him.
And then there's the looming threat of Trump's return to the political scene.
Yeah, can't forget about that. The elephant, or maybe the lion in the room.
That's a good one. Woodward doesn't hold back. He talks about Trump's enduring popularity, his rhetoric that often veers into dangerous territory, and his stated interest in using the military domestically if he gets back in power.
It's a scary thought, honestly. And Woodward even details specific threats that were made against General Milley for his actions during the Trump presidency, which just shows you how volatile things could get.
It's a stark reminder that democracy is fragile, and it requires constant vigilance to protect it.
And Woodward seems to be saying that the choices we make now, the leaders we choose, the actions we take, will have profound consequences for the future.
So much to think about. We've covered a lot of ground here, and we're just getting started.
Yeah, this is just scratching the surface of what Woodward uncovers in war. I'm ready for more.
Okay, so we just explored how the invasion of Ukraine and those Hamas attacks on Israel really shook things up globally. Like, it wasn't just about those specific events, right? It exposed these, like, cracks in the world order and forced everyone to make some tough choices.
Oh, for sure. And it's with all this chaos as a backdrop that the 2024 U.S. election happens, right? Like, Woodward takes us right inside the Biden campaign in war.
Yeah.
He shows how they're trying to balance Biden's, experience and foreign policy stuff,
Right, all that.
but also deal with those questions about, is he too old? Can he handle it all?
Oh, totally. It's like they're walking a tightrope, right? They want to seem strong and stable globally, but also got to address those concerns about, can Biden really do the job?
Yeah, exactly. And Woodward's honest about the moments where Biden, faltered a bit, like when he lost his train of thought giving speeches.
Yeah, yeah. Those moments, however brief, they play right into the anxieties people already have, right?
Yeah.
And of course, Trump and his people jump all over that.
Oh, absolutely. That's the thing about this book. Woodward contrasts the two campaigns so well. It's like Biden's trying to project this sense of calm competence.
Yeah.
And Trump's campaign, it thrives on that chaotic energy, feeding off the anger a certain segment of the population feels.
That's so true. It's a key insight from war, right? He shows how Trump connects with a certain segment of the population. They feel ignored by the establishment.
Totally. And that's powerful, that connection. But he also shows the danger there, like how it can undermine democracy, create all this division.
When you read about those Trump rallies in the book, you can feel the intensity, almost like a cult of personality, right? What is it about Trump that draws those people in like that?
I don't think Woodward gives a simple answer, but he gives some good insights. Like,
Hmm.
he suggests it's Trump's willingness to challenge the status quo. He speaks directly to those fears and frustrations people have.
Right.
He also points out how good Trump is with the media. Like, he controls the narrative even when he's, well, not being entirely truthful.
And that brings us to this really unsettling part of Trump's whole deal, right? His words, they could lead to violence. They erode trust in, like, democratic institutions. Woodward even talks about how, like, even after someone tried to assassinate him, Trump just kept using that divisive language.
Wow.
Almost like he used the attack to further his own agenda.
It's like, at that point, Woodward's almost giving a warning
Yeah.
about how fragile democracy is, how easily it can be, like, manipulated and ruined.
Right.
It's not just about Trump himself, though, is it? It's these bigger forces, populism, all the disinformation out there,
Yeah.
and how polarized everything's become.
Like, all these different things are coming together at once, right? Creating this, I don't know, perfect storm that could tear apart America.
Absolutely. And it's not just the U.S. either. We see this happening all over the world.
You're right. Authoritarianism rising, democratic norms going out the window, information being used as a weapon. It's global.
Totally. And war is like this wake-up call, recognizing the danger so we can protect our democratic values.
Okay, but how does all this connect back to, like, the Ukraine war, the Hamas attacks, the nuclear threat, all that heavy stuff we talked about?
Well, I think Woodward's saying these things are not just random events. They're symptoms of this, like
Yeah.
deeper problem.
Yeah.
Like the world order is breaking down. There's a leadership crisis.
Oh, okay.
And he's not just blaming the leaders. He's pointing at us, too. Like, we, the citizens, let this stuff happen.
That's a tough thing to hear, but it's probably true. We can't just be, like, complacent, right? We got to be informed and hold our leaders accountable.
Exactly. We got to challenge our own assumptions and biases, too, Really talk to each other, get different perspectives, work together to fix these problems, because they're not simple.
Right. Okay, so we talked about the U.S. political stuff, but let's go back to the global scene. One of the scariest things in war is how Woodward explores the nuclear threat. He takes you right inside the Situation Room, where decisions are made that could, like, end the world.
It's intense, right? You feel that urgency, the fear that one wrong move could set off this chain reaction with unimaginable consequences.
Woodward quotes Avril Haines, the director of national intelligence, right? And she says, when you push countries that have these weapons to the brink, you increase the risk that they will end up using them.
That's sobering.
It really makes you think, like, how precarious everything is, how easily things could just go off the rails.
For sure. And do we even have the right people in charge to deal with this nuclear stuff? That's a big question.
Right. Are we doing enough to prevent a catastrophe?
Woodward doesn't give clear answers to those, but he definitely makes you ask them.
Yeah.
He shows how Biden struggled with that, right? Like, some people were pushing for a more aggressive stance, send troops to Ukraine, retaliate against Iran. But Biden knew what could happen if he did that, like start a bigger war.
Maybe even a nuclear one. And that's where the back-channel diplomacy comes in. Woodward shows these secret talks, these high-stakes negotiations to try and stop things from getting worse.
Like some high-stakes poker game, but the world is on the line.
Right. He describes those phone calls between Biden and Putin, talking to Xi Jinping, trying to keep things from escalating, even though everything's so tense.
It shows you how crucial those one-on-one relationships are. It's not just about politics. It's about people making choices, taking risks, talking to each other.
You've got that scene where General Milley calls his Chinese counterpart to say, hey, we're not going to attack you. It's like a spy movie.
It's crazy that that's real. But it shows you, even when things are really bad globally, people are still trying to keep things under control.
It shows how important communication is, even with your enemies. Like, remembering we're all human.
It's like we're all connected, even when it feels like everything's pulling us apart.
But as you read War, you see how those lines of communication get weaker and weaker. The nuclear threat just keeps getting bigger.
And that's when Woodward brings in the story about Hunter Biden.
Oh, yeah. The president's son.
All his legal problems, his addiction issues, it becomes this weak spot for the administration. It's like, even the most powerful people, they're not immune to personal tragedies.
And those problems can affect how they lead, right?
It adds a whole other layer to this story. Makes you think about the cost of being in charge, the sacrifices, the weight they carry.
It's really interesting how Woodward handles that. Hunter Biden's clearly a flawed guy, but he's also got his dad's love and support.
Totally. Like, even with all this chaos going on globally, there are still those human stories, right? Love, loss, resilience, all of it.
It makes the whole thing more real, more human. Makes you realize even the most powerful people, they're just people.
Yeah. And then you wonder, how do those personal problems affect their decisions about the whole world? Like, can they separate those things?
Right.
Or does it all mix together? It's a good question. Woodward doesn't give you a straight answer, but he gives you enough to think about it yourself.
That's what makes war so good. It's not just this happened, then this happened. He's exploring the human stuff behind the headlines, those personal stories that change history.
Definitely.
Okay, so we've got the nuclear threat, leadership struggles, human stories. There's one more big thing in the book, the military. Woodward spends a lot of time on General Milley, particularly the final days of Trump being president.
Yeah, Milley's a really interesting guy in the book. Like, he's a career military guy stuck in this crazy political situation. He's got to uphold his oath to the Constitution, but his boss is, well, unpredictable.
It's like he's balancing on a razor's edge. He's trying to keep the military from taking over, to protect democracy in America, and he's doing it in this, like, super polarized, dangerous environment.
Totally. And Woodward shows how Milley pushed back against some of the stuff Trump wanted to do, how he worked behind the scenes to calm down allies and enemies. He did some pretty extraordinary things to make sure the U.S. military wouldn't be used to, like, mess up the election.
It shows you what kind of person Milley is, his commitment to that oath. But it also makes you wonder about, like, civilian control of the military. And what if you get a president who wants to use the army for personal gain?
Scary thought, right? Like, even in a democracy like the U.S., it's not guaranteed to always be there.
Right.
We got to work to protect it.
And at the end of war, the world feels really tense, like multiple crises happening, these huge questions about democracy, the use of military force. It all feels really heavy.
Oh, yeah, there's a lot to process. But it's a conversation we need to be having.
Definitely. And Woodward gives us the tools for that conversation, right? The knowledge, the insight. It's like he's telling us to get involved, to demand more from our leaders.
And he reminds us that we all play a role in what the future is going to look like.
It's been a heavy conversation, but really important. We're going to finish up our deep dive into war after a quick break. We'll look at how the book ends and what it says about what's to come. Stick around. We've been talking about some pretty intense stuff, right? Nuclear war, democracy crumbling, all that pressure on the people in charge. It's a lot. But one thing I really like about Woodward's War, he tells this huge story about global conflict and politics, but never forgets about the people involved.
That's what makes it so interesting to read. It's not just headlines. He takes you behind the scenes, shows you how decisions get made, what these people shaping the world are really thinking.
Yeah, exactly. Like that part where Biden's struggling with his son Hunter's problems, it's not just politics anymore, right? It's a dad dealing with something really personal and painful while also, like, having to deal with the whole world at the same time.
Makes you realize, even with all that power, they're still human, right? And Woodward doesn't just do that with Biden. He does it with everyone.
Oh, totally. Think about Zelensky. Woodward paints this picture of him leading his country through a brutal invasion, dealing with crazy pressure, trying to protect his family, too.
Yeah, and those little details Woodward puts in, they stick with you. Like how Zelensky and his wife slept in different rooms so they could take turns comforting their daughter because she was so scared of the bombs.
It's heartbreaking, really makes you think about the cost of war, not just the people killed and the damage, but those scars it leaves, the trauma that lasts for generations.
For sure. And Woodward doesn't try to hide how brutal it all is. The way he describes things in Gaza, the bombing, the civilians who died, it reminds you how war makes people forget about others being human too.
I remember reading that part about the young woman's body, how it was treated by those Hamas guys. Just awful. Makes you think about the worst points of humanity, what happens when hate and violence take over.
Yeah. It's tough to read, but it's important, We can't pretend those terrible things don't happen in war. We have to see them, understand them, learn from them.
It makes you think about the ethics of fighting a war, doesn't it? Using so much force, the responsibility to protect people, the line between winning and causing too much suffering.
Those are tough questions. Woodward doesn't give easy answers, but by showing us those hard truths, he makes us think about the world we live in, the choices we make as people and as a country.
Like he's saying, hey, this is how it is. It's messy, complicated, often awful. What are you going to do about it?
Yeah, he's not just giving you information. He's making you participate, be part of the conversation. He wants us to demand more from the people in charge and to take responsibility for the world we're making.
And then there's the whole nuclear war thing. Woodward takes you right into those meetings where they're making decisions that could end the world. It's almost too much to handle sometimes.
You can feel how serious it is, right? That fear of making one mistake and causing something terrible to happen. And it makes you wonder, are the people in charge actually ready for this? Are any of us?
I remember that quote from Biden talking about North Korea. He says to his advisors, "We're talking about the end of the world as we know it."
Whoa, that's intense. It shows you how big this problem is.
Yeah.
And with all the fake news and propaganda out there, who can you even trust anymore?
That's what's so good about Woodward's work. He's not just giving you one side, he's showing you what goes on behind closed doors, how those in power operate, how personal stuff and politics mix together to shape history.
It's about giving you the information and the different perspectives so you can make your own decisions, have real conversations, and expect more from those leading us.
So, where do we go from here? What are the big things from war that you think people should remember?
I think the biggest thing is remembering the world is complicated and everything's connected. What happens in one place affects everyone else. We can't just ignore what's happening in other parts of the world.
Right, we have to pay attention, be informed, work together to solve these problems, right?
Exactly. And we need to watch out for leaders who use fear and division to get what they want. They might win for a little while, but they hurt democracy and peace in the long run.
We need leaders who will talk to each other, work things out peacefully, and find common ground. Leaders who understand that war hurts people and who care more about doing what's right than getting more power for themselves.
And even though war is about some pretty dark stuff, I think it also gives us hope. There are people all over the world trying to make things better. People fighting for justice, peace, and a future where everyone has a chance. We need to support those people, listen to them, and work with them to build a better world.
This has been a heavy but really important conversation. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into Bob Woodward's War. We hope it's helped you understand what's happening in the world a bit better and encouraged you to think about these big issues.
Keep learning about these things. Hear different points of view. Talk to people. And remember, we all get to decide what the future looks like. Every choice we make, every conversation, every action counts.